The world woke up to shocking news on September 9, 2025, when Israel carried out an airstrike in Doha, the capital of Qatar. This was not just another strike in the long and bloody Israel-Hamas conflict. It was the first time Israel had launched a military operation directly on Qatari soil, targeting senior Hamas leaders who were living and working there. According to reports, at least 6 people were killed, including a Qatari security officer, and Hamas negotiator Khalil al-Hayya was among those in the vicinity but managed to survive. For many, this was a red line being crossed, not just an escalation against Hamas, but a direct violation of the sovereignty of a nation that had positioned itself for years as a mediator in the conflict. Qatar's reaction was swift and fierce. The government in Doha condemned the strike as a cowardly and illegal attack, calling it a blatant violation of its sovereignty and of international law. Officials pointed out that the Hamas political leadership present in Qatar had been there under arrangements linked to mediation and negotiation efforts, particularly regarding ceasefires and hostage release talks. For Qatar, this strike undermines its role as a trusted mediator. It also raises the question, if mediators cannot guarantee the safety of those they host, how can any serious negotiation process move forward? Beyond the diplomatic insult, Qatar framed the attack as an assault on the principles that hold up international relations: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the sanctity of neutral ground. Israel, however, offered its own justification. Officials claimed that these Hamas figures were not merely political representatives but active leaders with operational control over militant activities. Israel argued that Qatar had essentially provided safe haven to people they consider masterminds of terrorist attacks, including links back to the October 7th attacks of 2023. From the Israeli perspective, geography should not protect individuals directly involved in planning violence against their citizens. Israel called the strike precise and targeted, insisting that the operation was necessary in the name of counterterrorism and national defense. In other words, the Israeli government sees no distinction between striking Hamas leaders in Gaza, Lebanon, or Qatar if they believe those leaders pose an ongoing threat. The rest of the world did not see it the same way. International reaction came quickly, with condemnation pouring in from the United Nations, from Arab and Islamic countries, and even from some of Israel's Western allies. The UN Secretary General labeled the strike a flagrant violation of Qatar's sovereignty, raising alarms about what it means for international law if countries start attacking their enemies across borders without consent. Leaders in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman, expressed solidarity with Qatar, describing the attack as dangerous and destabilizing. In their view, this was not just an attack on Hamas, but an attack on the principle that sovereign nations are off limits to foreign militaries unless there is consent or international authorization. The legal questions here are profound. Under international law. Attacking another country without its consent is generally prohibited unless it is clearly an act of self-defense against an imminent threat. Israel would likely argue that Hamas leadership abroad still poses such an imminent threat, but critics say that does not give Israel the right to carry out an airstrike in the capital of another sovereign state, particularly one that is not actively involved in hostilities. Qatar is using this argument to demand accountability. Its foreign ministry has framed the incident as a test case for the rules-based international order. If one country can violate another's sovereignty without consequence, then the entire system of international norms collapses. This incident also strikes at the heart of mediation. For years, Qatar has hosted Hamas political figures and acted as a channel between the group and Israel in sensitive negotiations, particularly concerning prisoner swaps and temporary ceasefires. Whether or not one agrees with Hamas's presence in Qatar, the fact remains that those leaders were able to engage in talks precisely because Qatar provided them safety. Now, with Israel targeting them inside Doha, the credibility of any mediator is in question. If Hamas feels unsafe even in Doha, it may be less willing to engage in negotiations at all, and if mediators themselves fear retaliation, they may step back from these roles altogether. That could mean fewer opportunities for diplomacy and more reliance on military solutions. The impact on regional security is another major concern. Qatar is a wealthy Gulf state with strong ties to the United States, hosting one of the largest American military bases in the Middle East. By striking inside Qatar, Israel has risked complicating relations not only with Doha but potentially with Washington as well. The US has long relied on Qatar as a partner in mediation, especially when it comes to conflicts involving Hamas or the Taliban. If Qatar now feels humiliated or endangered, it might reassess its cooperation with both Israel and the West. Other Gulf countries, already uneasy about Israel's actions in Gaza and Lebanon, may harden their stance, leading to a broader rift in the region. Beyond the Gulf, the strike raises the possibility of new precedents. If Israel can target Hamas in Qatar, what is to stop other countries from targeting exiled political figures in places like Turkey, Lebanon, or even Europe? For example, would Turkey tolerate a strike in Istanbul on a Kurdish militant leader? Would France accept a missile landing in Paris because another country wanted to eliminate an opposition figure? These scenarios may sound extreme, but the logic is the same. If the precedent is set, the rules of international conduct begin to unravel. That's why so many nations, even those not directly involved, are so alarmed by this event. At the same time, it is worth noting that not all of Israel's goals appear to have been met. Reports suggest that several of the top Hamas figures, including those most wanted by Israel, actually survived the strike. This means that Israel has exposed itself to major international backlash without necessarily neutralizing its intended targets. That raises questions about the intelligence behind the operation, about the level of risk Israel was willing to accept, and about whether the strike was worth the cost in terms of diplomacy and reputation. For ordinary people watching all this unfold, the news may feel both confusing and frightening. On the one hand, Israel insists it is fighting terrorism and protecting its citizens. On the other, Qatar and much of the world see this as a dangerous escalation that violates basic principles of sovereignty and undermines peace efforts. What it means in practice is more instability, more mistrust, and potentially more violence. Every time the conflict takes a step outside of Gaza or southern Lebanon, the risk grows that it could spread further, dragging in more states, more actors, and more innocent people caught in the middle. Looking ahead, there are several questions that will shape what happens next. Will Qatar respond with more than words, perhaps expelling Israeli diplomats, pushing for sanctions at the United Nations, or even reducing cooperation with US military forces stationed on its soil? Will Hamas retaliate by hardening its stance in negotiations or by escalating attacks of its own? Will Israel double down on its strategy of targeting Hamas leaders abroad, or will international pressure force it to reconsider? And perhaps most importantly, how will this affect the broader peace process, fragile as it is, that relies on countries like Qatar to act as intermediaries? The strike in Doha may end up being remembered as a turning point. It shows just how far the conflict between Israel and Hamas has spread, no longer confined to the battlefields of Gaza or the streets of southern Israel, but now spilling into the capitals of the Gulf. It raises critical questions about international law, about the role of mediators, and about the balance between security and sovereignty, and it puts the entire region on edge as nations wait to see if this incident sparks a wider crisis or if cooler heads will prevail. Either way, it has made clear that the conflict is not contained and that its consequences are global, not just local.